Welcome back to day 3 of the Stowe Sew Along. In our previous video, I walked you through printing and assembling your PDF pattern. So if you're working from a PDF, you should have that assembled and ready to go. If you've purchased the printed pattern, you're all set. In today's lesson, we'll be tracing off our patterns onto our fabric, cutting, and then marking the stitching lines for the pockets. So let's dive in. Before we get started with our fabric, let's briefly talk about how woven fabric is made. As you can see in this image, woven fabric is constructed by weaving horizontal weft yarns over and under a series of vertical warp fibers. This action is done on a loom. The horizontal weft yarns run along what we call the cross grain, and the vertical warp yarns form the straight grain. At either edge, running along the length of the fabric, is the selve edge. This is a tightly woven edge finish created during manufacturing, and this is what you'll align your pattern's grain line with. Unlike the field bag, we don't need the Stowe to stand up on its own, so we do recommend pre-treating your fabric. You'll want to pre-wash and dry your fabric prior to cutting to reduce or eliminate shrinkage in your final bag. Make sure to wash your yardage using the same method you intend to wash your Stowe when it's completed. If you're making your own bias binding, you'll want to pre-wash the fabric for that as well. Most pre-made binding is pre-treated so that it won't shrink, and there's no need to pre-wash that. You're going to want to give your fabric a nice press to get out any wrinkles before you start cutting. Marking and sewing on a nice flat surface is always the most accurate way to work. The next step in cutting your pieces is laying out the fabric, and this step is pretty straightforward. First off, you're going to need to determine the right and wrong side of your fabric. If you're using a printed fabric, this is easy. The printed side is the right side. So here you can see on my fabric, I have this purple print on the right side, and then also the selve edge is printed. And then on the wrong side, it's just the natural canvas. If you're using a solid fabric like canvas, finding the right and wrong side is a bit less important since both sides look pretty much identical. If you can't tell which is the right or wrong side, then all you have to do is choose the side you like best. Now that we've determined the right and wrong side of our fabric, it's time to lay our fabric out with the selve edges together. A lot of people have you fold the right sides of the fabric together, but I prefer to fold mine with the right sides facing out. Often, as is the case with this fabric, it's hard to see the print on the wrong side of the fabric due to the fact that it's screen printed on the front. And that means you can potentially struggle with print and pattern matching and also just general placement. So to align our fabric, we would bring the two selve edges together, as I've done here. And you want to check to make sure there's no torquing along this edge. So what that means is if your fabric isn't lined up quite flat, you'll have torquing. This is very extreme, but just to show you, you'll have torquing here and this edge won't lay flat. So you just adjust. And this nails thing is a trick I learned while cutting very slippery fabrics. You can just run your nails along the top edge and it smooths things out very nicely. So now here our folded edges flat and we are ready to lay out our pattern pieces. To lay out your fabric, you'll need to know where each piece should go. The pattern instructions for the Stowe have cutting layouts for you that you can reference, but I'll also be demoing this as well. So here you can see we have the small bag for 45-inch wide fabric, the large bag for 45-inch wide fabric, 54-inch wide with a small, and 54 with a large. I have 45-inch wide fabric and I'll be making the small bag, so this is what I'll reference here. Before we start laying out our pieces, here's a little note about some of the tools I'll be using that I get a lot of questions about. I weigh my pattern pieces with professional cloth weights, but you can use anything. Cloth weights are also known as pattern weights, and they're made from cast iron and weigh about 4 pounds each. They're made to weight a pattern to cloth while tracing and cutting, and are low profile so you can easily maneuver around them. You can find these at any pattern making supply store. If you don't have cloth weights, we have a great tutorial on our blog to create your own small pattern weights. These are easy to make, easy to use, and are great for using up fabric scraps. I'll link the tutorial in the description below the video. Now, one last thing before we cut. There are a few markings we're going to want to cut into the pattern so that you can easily mark them onto your fabric. The first are these two notches at either side of the body of the bag. These are on the small and the large. So what I'm going to do is take my pattern notcher and I'm just going to clip those notches. If you don't have a pattern notcher, you can use a scissor to cut a little like triangle out. Then we also have notches on the two pockets as well. So we're going to want to snip those out. And the final thing is all these little stitching pivot points and markings. So I have an awl here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press it into the center of the circle and bring it through the pattern. And that just allows me to be able to mark through the pattern. It makes a nice little hole. And you'll be glad you had these markings when we go to sew. So let's start by laying out the pockets. We have pocket A and pocket B. These pockets are identical in size. The only difference is the stitching lines to create different size pockets. So when cutting, you can cut flat and cut out one of each of these, or you can cut two of one and mark them after the fact. So that's why we have 2 and 3 here. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to set aside piece 2. And I'm going to align the pattern with the grain line. And you might be thinking, well, this is a bag. Does the grain line really matter? And it does. It helps with the strength of the bag. If you cut it on the bias, it's going to stretch strangely in different directions. So I do recommend following the grain line for this. So now I'm just going to trace around my bag using my pencil. And I am a fan of tracing and then cutting after I remove the pattern, because that way I don't nick the pattern, you get a cleaner cut, and I like to make things more than once. So I want to keep my pattern intact because I like making things, but I hate taping the pattern together. All right, so that is piece 2. You can set that aside. Now we're going to place piece 1, which is the body of the bag, and we do need 2 of these. So again, I'm just going to make sure we're on grain. Weight my pattern and trace. And this trace line will be cut off, so it's totally fine that I'm using a number 2 pencil. Doesn't matter at all. It's always a little awkward to trace and make sure your head doesn't get in the way of the camera. Make sure I traced there. Yep, and then just the bottom left. Okay, now you can remove your pattern. And we need to cut these out. Now when I cut, I usually don't pin the 2 layers together as well. this fabric's not going to go anywhere. It's pretty stiff. So these weights are just fine for cutting. But if you feel nervous, you can put some pins in like the corners or wherever to help you feel secure cutting through the 2 layers. So now we just need to cut around. And here we have a notch, so we're just going to snip that. And we can easily snip into our fabric because our notch is only half as long as our seam allowance. So that's not going to show through into the seam. Again, that notch. We can set our pockets aside. And now we need to cut the body. Just gonna weight that down a little more. Cut across the bottom. And then at this point, it's going to be hard for me to cut around like that. So I'm just going to rotate my fabric slightly, re-weight, and continue cutting. Notch. I forgot to do the other one, so let's do that now. And you really do want these notches on there. It's going to help you line everything up, and your life will be a lot easier if you're not marking them when your bag is half sewn. Believe me. It's especially important for garments. So if something's notched, there's a reason. And now, just the handle drop area. And your bag is cut. Now, we're going to set this aside and we need to mark our pieces 2 and 3. Now again, since these 2 rectangles are identical on the outside, it doesn't matter which of these becomes piece 2 and which becomes piece 3. So just make sure you have the notches lined up with the notches. Align the pattern piece. And then we're just going to mark with our chalk or other removable marking utensil. Sorry, I got really into marking right there. You're going to mark all these with your removable marking utensil. So I'm using a chalk pencil. This is great. The ink is washable. You can see, get that in focus. You can also just stick a pin through here. If you're really into tailor's tacks, you can do that. Whatever works best for you. So now that is marked, although I'm sure you can't see from all the way up there. And then, time to do piece 3. And you're going to mark on the right side of the fabric like I'm doing because we're going to be stitching the pocket through on the right side. And if any of these don't show up or you miss them, we will be able to just line this back up and remark once it's attached to the body of the bag, because we sew the pockets before we sew the sides, so don't stress out. But that is it. We have our pockets cut and marked. You can see I have my lines there. And here we have the two body pieces. All right, so that is it for today's lesson and for the prep work. In our next lesson, we'll be assembling the pocket, so make sure you've got everything cut and marked before then. Cutting always feels like the most time-consuming part to me, especially with a project that sews up as quickly as the Stowe does. So I'll see you back here for our next lesson, and if you have any questions, as always, let me know in the comments below. Bye-bye.